know what conservatives do with school reform, but what about liberals, and what about all that liberal money influencing school reform? Joined now by Rick Hess, resident scholar and director of education policy studies at the AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. Rick, welcome to Behind the Curtain.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well,
thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you. So tell us now, when we talk about school reform, generally it's on the right, and we're talking about charter schools, and I think our audience knows all about that, the politics of all that. We've talked ad nauseum about all that over the years. But now I love what you're looking at, and some of these school reform groups, or a lot of these groups, are donating to very left-wing causes. Let's look at the left. Tell us what you know.
Sure. So what we did, my colleague Jay Green at the University of Arkansas and I did a study. We asked for the folks in the world of school reform who work at organizations funded by the Walton Family Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the two far and away biggest funders of school reform groups. We asked the folks who report that they work at these various grantees, who do they choose to give contributions to? And it turns out that when you look, for instance, at the employees who work at Gates education grantees, that 99% of their contributions go to Democrats, 1% go to Republicans.
Interesting.
When you look at the employees who work at the Walton work at grantees funded by the Walton Family Foundation, 87% of their contributions go to Republicans. 87% of their contributions go to Democrats. 13% go to Republicans.
Isn't that kind of strange? Sam Walton was a Republican, right? Sam was, he was a big Republican fundraiser, if I remember, right?
Mm-hmm. No, that's exactly right. And this is what's striking. I mean, these are organizations, these are school reform groups that work on what they call teacher and leadership pipelines, that are groups working on alternative job pathways. They're working on charter school issues. What this suggests is that these groups are almost uniformly staffed by Democrats, and that means when they are talking about issues like equity or about fairness or about why they are concerned with how they think we should talk about issues like equality and opportunity, they tend to bring an understanding and a vocabulary that you would expect to see at an Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders rally. They tend not to talk about these things the way folks who live in red America would think and talk about equality and opportunity.
Interesting. So is it the case that, in other words, maybe it's the case that anytime you set up a foundation, the type of people who work in these nonprofits are just liberals, or is this something directed down? Are we seeing the Walton heirs, Sam's daughters or something, or are we seeing Bill and Melinda Gates? Is this strategic in that they are targeting, they want to have liberals working in these nonprofits, or is it just the type of people that go into nonprofits?
That's a fantastic question, and it's one that Jay and I just can't answer in this study, because what we did was we looked at the campaign contributions from the people who work at these groups using opensecrets.org, and there's just no way to tell why things are shaking out. I can say a couple things. One is that when you look at the list of Walton and Gates grantees, it really does look like it covers the waterfront of what we think of as school reform.
And tell me what types of people are getting the grants?
Teach for America, the KIPP charter schools, the New Schools Venture Fund, Jobs for the Future.
So is that, are you saying, is that a mix of left and right, or is it, how does that skew?
They're all the brand names. If you had somebody who has read a little bit over the years about school reform, and you look down the list of folks, you'll say, yeah, pretty much everybody I've ever heard of is getting some money here. So what that really tells me is that this whole world has really taken on this really blue hue. Now, it wasn't always this way. 15, 20 years ago, school reform tended to feel much more like a bipartisan exercise. You had centrist Democrats, but you also had a lot of Republicans. And I think what's happened through the Common Core fight, through the way that a lot of, say, charter school groups threw themselves wholeheartedly in with Black Lives Matter, the way that these groups have tended to denounce Republicans when it comes to DACA or when it comes to immigration. Obama's former Secretary of Education said that charter schools taking any money from the Trump administration was tantamount to taking blood money. I think what you've seen over time is a shift in which the conservatives have tended to either feel not welcome or pushed out, and you've seen a younger generation of, true blue progressives really, populating these organizations.
So progressive means what? Progressive means they're against charter schools. They support strong. In other words, it's strong federal funding and strong federal involvement in higher education.
Especially K-12 education. So here's an interesting thing that, and this is where Jay and I kind of suggest that a lot of school reform is an intramural fight. There is a wing of progressives who are obviously hate charter schools. We've seen that. But it also turns out that at least in these organizations, these charter school groups, they're mostly staffed nowadays by progressives. And so these are so there's progressives who like charter schools, but they like charter schools which tend to embrace the Black Lives Matter narrative of American history, who tend to champion affirmative action.
I see.
Who have embraced the call to abolish ICE.
We've lost control. We conservatives have lost control of even the charter school movement because the type of people staffing the nonprofits, even they are left wing.
That's right. I mean, I think once upon a time, 10, 15 years ago, the charter movement was much more a real bipartisan mix. You would find folks who felt like I just described, but you also had a lot of more conventional Republicans, and so there was a healthy balancing act. And what you're seeing is a real shift from that.
It sounds like education is it sounds like the forces of political correctness and affirmative action are basically conspiring to really weaken, undermine, and federalize American education. Is that accurate?
I think I'm never comfortable with I know you just meant it rhetorically, but I'm never comfortable with the phrase conspire. But I think
I meant it literally. I meant it literally, not rhetorically. I meant it quite literally.
So I want to go quite that far. But what I would say is, look, the reason that we care so much about schools is this is where we teach values to our children. Schools are not just places where kids learn to do math and read and pass tests. They're places where they learn about what kind of country we are, what kind of people we want them to be. And I think what we are seeing is a school reform movement which is increasingly dominated. And again, I don't know that I would say conspiratorial, but for whatever reason, it's increasingly dominated by people who have a vision of America and of American history that you would expect to find at a Bernie Sanders rally. And I find that really troubling for what I think makes for a healthy nation.
I think that you said it better than I did, but even more troubling than that, forget about left, right, and belief. History should still be factual and accurate, right? I have a friend, the reason for my interest in this, I have a good friend who sells books. He was my high school social studies teacher 35 years ago, 40 years ago. And he's now an executive with McGraw-Hill. He sells books. And his complaint is, most of what he focuses on is history and social studies and all of that for high school. And his complaint is they constantly, in order to sell books to the big districts, have to fictionalize them. Like, for instance, there has to be a third of the chapter about the American Revolution devoted to black contributions to the American Revolution. And there may be a few black contributions to the American Revolution, but it's small, and it shouldn't be a third of the chapter. They have to fictionalize American history.
So, I think so it's interesting. So that's selling to districts, too, which is an interesting thing. When you look at the survey data on school districts, which as a conservative, I tend to be uncomfortable with these bureaucracies. It turns out that school districts about 40% of teachers are Democrats, but about 30% are Republicans, about 30% are independents. So school districts, even with all of this politically correct zaniness that you just pointed out, tend to feel something like America. What's striking about these school reform groups, these are people who most conservatives think as being the good guys. They're the ones trying to bust up these bureaucracies. They're the ones fighting for accountability. But it turns out that they are not only worried with this kind of bureaucratic, politically correct proportions, but these are folks who are, the KIP leadership. I'm a huge fan of the KIP.
Maybe it's time to bust the teachers' unions one at a time. I mean, at the core of all this, the teachers' unions are the problem. Maybe it's time for a tough president. This is what I would do if I were President Berkman. I might target a certain area like Los Angeles, and I would say no more federal funding until the teachers' unions disband. And then just shut it down and let that go and fight that fight until you crush the union. Maybe that's what we should do.
That's certainly one of
Well, Reagan did it with the air controllers. Maybe that's what you do. Yeah. Bust these public unions one by force. Bust them. Crush them.
So it's interesting. I mean, so one of the striking things here is that one of the things Jay and I show in this paper is, for instance, the NEA, which is the nation's largest teachers union, is actually to the right of these school reform groups. It gives the NEA.
That's scary. No, that's the scariest thing I ever heard.
School reform groups. Yeah, and it's nuts. But it's interesting. What you point out is that conservatives are comfortable with the idea that they, should be skeptical of the unions and regard them as, engaged in fighting for things that conservatives take issue with. These reformers we tend to think of as the good guys, but if you're looking in terms of who's further to the left, turns out that these reform groups are arguably further to the left than the nation's biggest teacher union.
Rick, thank you so much. It's one more reason, ladies and gentlemen, why political correctness and affirmative action and the public unions are destroying the United States. Rick Hess, resident scholar and director of Education Policy Studies at the AEI. What a great study he and his partner did. 2020 for the Democrats. How's it looking? I don't think it's looking too good at all. I think Trump, or whoever the Republican nominee is, may have a very easy time in 2020, and I'll tell you why. If you look at 1968 and 1972, and I think that's the parallel, 2016 and 2020, I think are very analogous to 1968 and 1972, and I'll tell you why. 1968, close race. Richard Nixon won by a very similar margin that Trump won by in 16. He ran a law and order campaign. So did Trump. He preyed on white working class fears. So did Trump. He struck a note of populism. So did Trump. Very similar. What happened in 1968? The Dems went even further left. They went even further left. For those of you old enough to remember the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. Chicago 7. Craziness, madness, Dan Rather getting thrown down on the convention floor. All of this left-wing mania, where did it lead? Fast forward to 1972, the party went way, way to the left. They wound up with George McGovern. George McGovern Shriver, can you imagine? He wanted a 90% inheritance tax. The same thing is happening now, only the Democratic Party is moving even farther to the left. Can you believe it? They're further than George McGovern. I'm not sure George McGovern would even be a Democrat in today's party. They're too wacko. Now, all of this, we're not going to, obviously Nixon in 1972 won by a giant margin, winning 49 states. That won't happen now because of the way the map is different. But Trump or whoever the nominee is may well win by a margin that's far more significant than what Trump won by in 2016. Let's look at these Dems. Find me a Dem that can actually win. Let's take a look. Cory Booker, he's a dud. He's not going anywhere. Bernie Sanders, Bernie Sanders is running a smarter campaign. He's tooling up. He's going to do better with the African-American vote. He's got a stronger staff. He has more money. He has the experience. He has a better organization because he ran before. he's bigger, stronger, better. But Bernie Sanders is not going to be elected president. I think we can take a quick look at him and say he can't win the general election. Kamala Harris. Now, Kamala Harris, I think for a liberal, again, assuming her philosophy, which I don't like, but assuming someone likes liberal philosophy, I think she has a lot to offer. She's smart. She's attractive. She's electable if the country is the country ready for an African-American female. I don't know. That's a question for a sociologist. It's a question for an historian. I don't know. It depends what lessons we draw from Barack Obama. What lessons can be drawn? Obama was a very, very special guy. I'm not sure the lesson that can be drawn is America post-Obama is ready for anything. I'm not sure those are the lessons. Now, I wish color weren't a factor. I wish color weren't a variable, but I think it is. But Kamala Harris, of course, not only African-American, but female, you're essentially crossing two barriers at once. If I were Kamala Harris, I think her time will come in this country. I may have waited because I think she could have been a strong candidate in the future for the Democratic Party. Then, you know, that basically what you come down to when you go through all the list is there's only one Democratic candidate that I think would have any chance at electability, and that's Joe Biden. Joe Biden is an excellent politician. I would never sell him short. He's the moderate in this field. In this field, he's the moderate. Now, that could mean that the liberals, as you sweep through the South and Super Tuesday, will split up the vote. Maybe Biden could win the nomination by getting only 15 or 17% of the vote very, very early on. He also may have, at least with the possible exception of Bernie Sanders, the largest organization, the most money. He's going to have a lot of everything. Now, I'll make you one more prediction. I'm not entirely certain that a person named Hillary Rodham Clinton is not running. Yes, she said that, but I've done battle with the Clintons for 2 decades, and I will tell you, somehow, I just can't picture them going away peacefully, going into retirement, and just looking after their grandchildren. Somehow, I don't think that will happen. Now, let's get to your questions and answers. Remember, this is how you can participate in the D.C. process. Josh in Detroit writes, recently the founder of Greenpeace blasted climate change science for being a hoax. And now major unions are saying they are opposed to a Green New Deal. Well, it's one more way in which, Josh, you're right on the money, the Democratic base is being divided because the unions know with this crazy Green New Deal, they lose jobs. Crazy AOC wants no airplane travel by the year 2030. By the year 2030, she wants no airplane travel in the United States. Someone should tell her, I don't know if she's ever been outside of Queens, but somebody should tell her that America is big, and it is 3,200 miles from Queens to San Francisco. The base is being split. Now, here's another way the Democratic base is being split. Josh, you may not have thought of this. If you look at the conflicting messages on impeachment, you have people like Tom Steyer, the Enviro-nut in California, saying he will oppose any Democrat in the primary with money who doesn't support impeachment. Then you have Nancy Pelosi saying she doesn't want any impeachment. Conflicting messages to the base on impeachment, on scandal, on Green New Deal. It could mean the Democratic base stays home in 2020. That's what we want. Remember, you got to hit the like button, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Now, I want all of you to go to BehindTheCurtainRadio.com, BehindTheCurtainRadio.com, and hit that podcast button, BehindTheCurtainRadio.com. That's how you can help, aside, of course, from sending in your questions. Wyatt in Ohio. For weeks, Biden has hinted he will join the race for president. We should get on with it already. You think he actually has a chance to secure the Democratic nomination? I think he does. And more than that, I think he's the only Democrat who could win in the fall. I don't think a Democrat will be elected in 2020. I'd be very surprised. Biden, who's a career far left-wing liberal, as you may know, has now emerged as the center of the Democratic Party, which is frightening. People like Bill Clinton are now the far right. He's almost thrust into the Republican Party. That's how crazy the Democratic Party has become. Paul in Florida, Conservatives have been getting shut down, Paul writes, on social media for quite a while, but now it's happening to Democrats, too. Elizabeth Warren has criticized tech monopolies and Facebook temporarily banned ads, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let's not, they're doing a few things to make themselves seem balanced, but let's not ignore the reality that Silicon Valley is very, very far left-wing. Ultimately, here's what we need, Paul. We need to create a conservative Facebook, a conservative Twitter, a conservative YouTube, a conservative Instagram. We need to create our own, just like there are efforts underway now to create a conservative AARP. We're doing conservative versions of different groups. We need that for Silicon Valley. Problem is, it's not happening. We don't have any billionaires that want to get active. Toby in Seattle, where my brother lives, New York City is careening towards bankruptcy and California is close behind. You bet. As their states burn, leftists keep passing radical legislation instead of solving the crisis. Will this wake the country up to the foolishness of it all? Well, it certainly won't wake up New York or California. This is a classic case of what happens when states are run by liberals for not years, not decades, but really half a century or more. In New York's case, if you look at the last 100 years, it's had very little Republican involvement. California, since the 70s, very limited Republican anything. And you see people are now leaving California in droves because nobody wants to pay an 11% state tax. Let's say that again, 11% state tax. In New York City, Mr. de Blasio, well, he's never met a social program he doesn't like. He's probably added more than 50, and he's trying to add 50 more. He doesn't even want Amazon. Amazon says, we're coming with thousands of new jobs. He doesn't want that. Oh, my. Listen, we're going to get into all these topics on the podcast. You got to go to behindthecurtain.com, behindthecurtainradio.com. Hit that podcast button. We need you to do it. Do it right now. Go to your computer, go to your phone, behindthecurtainradio.com. Hit the podcast button. Finally, Lisa in Maine. Paul Manafort is clearly being railroaded by a vindictive bureaucratic state. I would add deep state too, Lisa. After years of the Russia probe, investigators have nothing. Yeah, Manafort regrets getting involved with Trump. That's the only reason he's being prosecuted for anything. The sentencing with Judge Ellis in Virginia is all about things. It's really all about things that have nothing whatsoever to do with the Trump investigation, the so-called Russia investigation. The judge noted that for the bench. That's why the sentence was fairly weak. But Amy Berman Jackson, the judge in D.C., you can bet will give him a much stiffer sentence. He got 4 in Virginia. He's probably going to get 10 to 12 in D.C. Here's the good news for Paul. He's not going to have to serve any of it because right after the 2020 election, whether Trump wins or loses, assuming Trump is the nominee, he will pardon Paul Manafort, and I think he will pardon others, and I think it'll be well-deserved because by that time, Paul Manafort will have already been in jail for over 2 years. Well, thanks for your attention to this important topic.